Okay, and we are now recording. So once again, we are here for a book talk by Peter Martin, author of China's Civilian Army, The Making of Wolf Warrior Diplomacy. And joining me is Dr. Maria Repnikova. She's an expert on Chinese political communication and an assistant professor in global communication at Georgia State University. She has written widely on China's media politics, including propaganda, journalism practices, and soft power. Dr. Repnikova is the author of the award-winning book, Media Politics in China, Improvising Power Under Authoritarianism, published by Cambridge in 2017. A forthcoming book, Chinese Soft Power, and many academic articles. She also has bylines in the New York Times, Washington Post, and other international news outlets. In addition to her work on China, she has also carried out comparative work on media politics in China and Russia, and is currently completing a monograph on Chinese soft power in Africa. In the past, Dr. Repnikova was a Wilson Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, a postdoctoral fellow at the Annenberg School for Communication, and a visiting fellow at Beijing University, amongst other positions. Dr. Repnikova holds a doctorate in politics from Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. So thank you so much, Dr. Repnikova, for being with us today and for inviting Peter Martin to talk with us. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Diana. It's a real pleasure and honor to host Peter. I've been following his writings for quite some time, journalistic writings, but I've just finished his incredible book. I'm just gonna put it up here. It's full of different notes, as you can see, because I've been highlighting all kinds of stuff. So Peter is defense policy and intelligence reporter for Bloomberg News, but he's written really widely on US-China relations from different perspectives, including reporting from China-North Korea border, as well as from Xinjiang, which has been obviously a hotspot in Chinese politics, but also in China's image in the world. But most importantly for our discussion today, he has written this incredible book. It's called China's Civilian Army. I'm going to put it up again, The Making of Wolf Warrior Diplomacy. So it's really a rare treat to read something that engages with a contemporary phenomenon of, Chinese diplomacy, Chinese diplomatic practice that's been termed as wolf warrior for its kind of aggressive pursuits of power and image making, but to see it in historic perspective, to kind of this incredible grand tour of history of Chinese diplomacy, where it came from, how it emerged and developed, and what are its weaknesses and challenges, as well as opportunities that it's facing today under Xi Jinping. So it's really kind of a historic tour of a lot of themes that I was previously somewhat aware of, but I've learned tremendously from the stories, from the personalities covered in this book, and really, underscoring the key takeaways about why Chinese diplomacy seems so contradictory, I think, to us as observers, but especially to some Western observers unaware of China or not quite as engaged with China on an everyday basis. So today we're going to have a conversation with Peter. We're very lucky that he joined us and found time for us today to talk about some of the key themes in this book. I'm going to start off with a couple of questions, that I gathered from reading this, and then I'm going to introduce my colleague here, who's already, you can see him on the screen, Andrew Wedeman. He's from Political Science Department at Georgia State University, a very renowned scholar of corruption in China. He's written widely on China's domestic politics and is currently completing another book manuscript. I don't know what the tentative title is, but maybe Andy can tell us when he starts to pose his questions, but he's been writing very thoroughly and widely on domestic politics and corruption, anti-corruption campaign in China. And I think the image making and the domestic facets of this diplomatic practice will speak very, very closely to his work as well. So I'm really excited that we can both be in this conversation with Peter. So just to start off with a kind of a broad question, that I was struck by this phrase in your book that read as the following: the People's Republic has had wolf warriors for as long as it had diplomats. So it has had wolf warriors for as long as it had diplomats, and you often make this connection with the Mao era and arguing that what we're seeing today in today's China with this aggressive pursuit of its image, and in particular, sometimes very contradictory messaging, off-putting remarks, or somewhat undiplomatic conduct is nothing new and perhaps has roots back even in the Mao period. So I wanted to start with this phrase that we've known kind of wolf warrior diplomacy for as long as we've known Chinese diplomacy. What does that mean? And if you could tell our listeners a bit more about why you kind of carry this argument throughout your book.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks again for hosting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. But I guess of course, in many ways, there's a lot that's new about the wolf warrior phenomenon. The use of social media, the sheer degree of confidence that many Chinese leaders and some Chinese diplomats have about China's place in the world. But I guess as I was researching the book and trying to figure out why Chinese diplomats behave the way they do, it was really striking that in the past there had been these moments which seem to, maybe they're not the same, but they at least rhyme very strongly with what's going on now. So in 1950, this veteran revolutionary called Wu Xiaotran led a delegation to the United Nations in New York, and he delivered a speech which Time magazine described at the time as 2 awful hours of rasping vituperation. So not so different in tone to some of today's diatribes that we see from Chinese diplomats. And in the 60s, of course, Chinese diplomats were expelled from places like Kenya and Indonesia. They handed out copies of Mao's little red books on the streets of foreign capitals, and they even engaged in a fist fight with protesters on the streets of London, which has kind of eerie similarities with a fist fight that Chinese diplomats recently got into in Fiji, where they put a Taiwanese diplomat in concussion. So I started to think about, like, why is this and why is there such continuity? And I think it really comes down to kind of the culture of the foreign ministry. When the ministry was set up in 1949, China's leaders had to tread this very careful line between being open to the outside world and winning friends, establishing China as the legitimate, the Communist Party as the legitimate government of China in the eyes of the world, and also being really paranoid about outside influences, threats to their power. And so they came up with this idea that Chinese diplomats would think and act like the People's Liberation Army in civilian clothing. And any of you who follow Chinese military affairs know that the signature feature of the People's Liberation Army is that it does what the party tells it. So I think this has resulted in a diplomatic corps which is incredibly receptive to the whims and wishes of China's top leadership. And so when they want to charm the world, Chinese diplomats go out and do that. But when the top leadership is focused on political purges at home, on ideology, on building up a cult of personality, Chinese diplomats prove their loyalty to that set of priorities, and it results in what we would now call kind of wolf warrior displays of behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. It sounds to me, or from what you're saying as well, that this kind of practice has both a certain advantage of flexibility and adaptability. The Chinese diplomats, especially the most renowned ones you cover in this book, that Joe and I, of course, is the main manifestation, as being extremely adaptive to political winds, but also able to turn on the charm, but also to be able to turn on the more aggressive or more confident mode of behavior. And yet at the same time, this adaptability seems to also sometimes be a challenge, or especially in international image making, because it turns off the global publics. And in your book, it sounds to me as if the argument about China's capacity to kind of win over public audiences globally is fairly constrained, and it doesn't seem very optimistic in terms of even where we are today undersea, despite all the resources invested in public diplomacy and soft power, despite China's economic might rising around the world, especially in global south. It still seems like Chinese diplomacy is very challenged by this kind of contradiction of having to appease domestic leadership, but also domestic nationalism, right? That's something you bring up at the end of the book. So do you see this as somewhat, this trajectory of kind of wolf warrior behavior as continuing to grow and kind of to harden, or do you think that there's still room for another kind of inversion of this, or something else shifting to allow for maybe more charming or more flexible behavior that's more externally oriented versus domestically oriented?
Yeah, so I guess on the first piece, it's very tricky for them to kind of sell China, in the sense that, like, Xi Jinping seems to expect a tough tone from them, and diplomats who take that tone, Zhao Lijin, one of the current spokespeople, kind of got his job by picking a Twitter fight with former US National Security Advisor Susan Rice, and there are other examples too. So it is kind of difficult for them to be persuasive and appealing if that's the incentive set that they're presented with. But I think there's also a kind of more profound problem for them, which is that when you think about periods in the past where Chinese diplomacy has been really successful, its diplomats have been focused on selling the country's message, but they've also had a good, appealing message to sell. And the policies that China is pursuing under Xi Jinping from, its behavior in the South and East China Seas to its border clashes with India, the crackdown in Hong Kong, the abolition of presidential term limits, and of course, everything that's going on in Xinjiang just makes a really, really difficult set of packages to sell. I don't know how you rewrite the press release about re-education camps in Xinjiang in a way that is palatable to Western audiences. I don't think it's really possible. So I guess those are the kind of twin challenges that they face at the moment, and that does make diplomacy really, really difficult for them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really see it changing in the short to medium term. Of course, you have to be careful because in the past, China has pulled off some really impressive turnarounds. I don't think, because it took the world by surprise when China and the US made nice in the early 70s. And it was so hard to see how that could have come from the kind of chaos and disaster of the Cultural Revolution. And similarly, the Charm Offensive of the 90s and the 2000s coming in the aftermath of the Tiananmen massacre was also a surprise. But I think that Xi Jinping kind of likes the hardline policies and seems pretty determined to continue with them. In part because he has this kind of I think macho view of global politics, and in part because he is, as far as I can tell, pretty persuaded by this idea that the US is in terminal decline, and so are many of its allies. And even if there is a backlash, maybe it doesn't matter too much because eventually China's hard power will speak for itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to pose one more question before turning here to Andy, but I was wondering, I know that this book is, of course, primarily on China, but do you see this kind of practice and just this challenges of diplomacy is unique in the China case, or do you think that other diplomats or other powers, in particular, I'm thinking of authoritarian powers, but also major global powers, do they face similar challenges? For instance, you could think of diplomats as bureaucrats, facing potentially pressures from other bureaucratic, other bureaucracies, like you talked about in the China case, but also from their superiors back, say, in Washington for American diplomats, as well as public opinion being nationalistic in one direction or another. So do you see Chinese kind of challenges, this kind of challenges they're facing as unique and, really uniquely rooted in its historic context and its political system? Or do you think that there are some similarities or perhaps something that's maybe perhaps similar to other contexts, especially major powers that are dealing with this various crises in global affairs?
Yeah, so I think that all diplomats in all political systems have to think about multiple audiences. They have to think about the people sitting across from them in the room. They have to think about foreign publics, and they have to think about folks back home and their immediate bosses. And, I think you can kind of think of countries as being on a spectrum, right? Like, definitely you can make an argument that, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was performing very heavily for domestic audiences when he was in charge of the State Department. But there are also institutional constraints in place in places like America that mean that, for example, US Foreign Service officers serve multiple administrations. They are not responsive to any one political party, and they're expected to have a kind of political loyalty that transcends any particular administration. And that's not really true of China. Chinese diplomats are part of the Chinese state, but there's only one party and it's very, very firmly in charge of foreign affairs. And I think for that reason that they are even more responsive, perhaps much more responsive to domestic pressures than diplomats in other institutional contexts would be. And I don't know that it's uniquely Chinese. North Korean diplomats can be famously provocative and act in kind of similar ways. Chinese diplomats, of course, have a much higher degree of professionalism and a much more international experience, and they're more cosmopolitan, but still there are kind of echoes and the way that Soviet diplomats acted at points during the Cold War, I think, is also kind of comparable. So maybe not uniquely Chinese, but there's a responsiveness to China's political system, and that matters a great deal, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So I just wanted to give a chance for Andy to ask some questions as well before we also remind the audience, whoever is listening here. We see a lot of black screens, but I know you guys are tuning in and listening attentively. So please prepare your questions. You can put them in chat and I can read them out for you, or you can turn on your camera and read the question yourself and introduce yourself to Peter. So, but for now, please welcome Andy and welcome your questions for Peter as well.
Well, thank you, Maria, and thank you, Peter, for this very interesting session and a very interesting book, very readable, very sweeping in its scope, and I think quite insightful in the fact that you highlight the reality that Chinese foreign policy, while it may move back and forth, is surprisingly consistent. And with that in mind, and also the fact that next week is the half-century anniversary of Nixon's trip to China, half the length, of course, of China's century of humiliation. I'd like to push the time frame even a little further and ask you, first of all, is the aggressive, snarling diplomacy of Xi Jinping's wolf warriors a complete and fundamental break from the way the barbarian handlers of the imperial tributary system dismissed foreign emissaries such as England's Lord Macartney as only fit to kowtow in fear and awe at the feet of the emperor?
Yeah. So it's a really interesting question. In the book, I tended to focus much more on the kind of Leninist party roots of the way that China behaves, roots in the Soviet Union's system of foreign affairs, and how that's in many ways like continued in China, and that shapes things. But I think it's undoubtedly true that there is a bigger cultural context there too. In the Chinese case, there are roots in the tributary system and this idea of China at the center. And I think also you can make a persuasive argument that all big powers and great powers kind of have this problem a little bit. The strategist Edward Luttwak has written about this on a global scale, and he uses a phrase which is not particularly politically correct. I wouldn't endorse it, but he calls it great power autism. This idea that great powers have a particular problem with understanding the emotional context they work in because they're too strong and too powerful, and it blinds them to some of those things. And so I think that in a general sense is true of China, just as it's true of the United States. And then you've got the tributary history kind of laid on top of that, plus the Communist Party system. And so, yeah, all of those things kind of come together to create an image which is off-putting sometimes to outsiders.
So let me follow up on that and then ask you, and I think you gave me, you led into what your answer may be, but let me ask you anyway. Is the ever louder snarling of Xi Jinping's wolf warriors reflective of a leadership that sees China not as becoming akin to Tianlong's fire-breathing dragon of the late 18th century, but rather one that fears China is more like Xi's feeble dragon of the latter 19th century, surrounded by hostile barbarians and facing debilitating internal cancers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the most kind of fascinating things about trying to look at Chinese foreign affairs up close, is that China has reached this point where it's undoubtedly a global power and a global player. You just think of the Russia-Ukraine crisis unfolding at the moment, and the degree of attention which is focused on anything that China says about it, and the fact that, of course, Chinese diplomats and President Xi have felt empowered to speak out against NATO expansion in Europe. That's the sign of, in a way, that China would never have commented on security affairs so far away until recently. So there is this new degree of confidence, which I think has kind of stretched back to the 2008 global financial crisis, and this belief that China has kind of arrived on the world stage. And that is a very, very powerful driver of the way that that China behaves, and maybe that's kind of along the Qianlong type model, but nested alongside that, kind of uncomfortably, is this continuing insecurity about China's role on the stage, on the global stage. This belief that it's patronized, it's not taken seriously, it's not treated as an equal, and also insecurity about China's domestic problems. Is the growth runway going to run out? Is China going to grow old before it grows rich? Are independent groups in China's business, like in China's business environment, like Jack Ma, or civil society or the media, are they going to threaten party rule? So there is this constant insecurity that sits alongside that great confidence, and it makes for quite a kind of volatile mix of emotions when it comes to China's external behavior.
Thank you.
We have a question here coming in from John Garver, who is a professor at Georgia Tech, and he's listening in, and as well as Penny Prime, who was with us here at Georgia State at the business school. I just recently retired and very active in our China community. So they posed a question regarding opposition or any kind of, I guess, resistance to this wolf warrior diplomacy style, which is something I also had in my mind as I was reading the book. It sounded as if there is really kind of a almost not a unanimous, but there's this degree of congruence or agreement that one has to represent domestic kind of interest, but domestic interest, if it means Xi Jinping's kind of a bolsterous style of global politics, there isn't very much room to maneuver or to push back. So the question was, to what extent is there opposition to this foreign policy approach that is assertive towards India, for example, or Taiwan or Japan? So other voices that are, signaling that, and if so, do they have space to actually be heard?
Yeah. So John Garver is one of my intellectual heroes. I think he's like one of the best writers on Chinese foreign policy. So I'm very grateful that he's listening. I guess the first thing to say is that I think that wolf warrior diplomacy feels very different when you're a Chinese diplomat, as opposed to when you're a sort of foreign audience looking at it. When I was based in Beijing, I would ask Chinese diplomats about these outbursts, and the really striking thing was the sheer degree of kind of like frustrated exhaustion that they feel about the reception that China gets in the world. And they would say things like, we try so hard. We have organized trips out to Xinjiang to show the truth of what is happening out there. We hold press conferences 5 times a week. Foreign Minister Wang Yi has repeated again and again that China doesn't have any bad intentions on this, but no one will listen to us. And I think that frustration is real. They are working overtime. They are pouring a huge amount of effort into these endeavors, and yet the messages don't land in the way that they want to. And I think that China's policies are, more to blame for that than anything else. But the frustration is real, and the outbursts to them, sometimes I think they feel like it's justified. They're just standing up for themselves in a world that won't take them seriously. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say, I think, though, is that Chinese diplomats, for all of the differences between China's political system and America's or Western European political systems, they're still diplomats. These are still people who dedicated their lives to the vocation of making China's case to the world. They could have gone into military service or joined intelligence agencies, but they didn't. They chose diplomacy. So they care about China's reputation. Many of them have studied overseas. Many of them have spent decades living overseas, and they have a pretty sophisticated understanding of how foreign audiences react to what China's doing. And many of them are acutely aware that wolf warrior diplomacy has created a really major backlash. And some of them have kind of said it publicly. Cui Tiankai, who was until recently China's ambassador in Washington, has now said on a couple of occasions that that there's a risk of a backlash. And in December, he issued a set of remarks where he said that China needed to be careful about something like Chinese officials trying to become internet celebrities, and I think he could only be referring to Zhao Lijin when he said that. So there is this concern, but I don't think that those voices are really really influential. It's the incentive system that matters rather than the perspective of any individual diplomat or even group of diplomats. And the incentives at the moment are geared towards speaking out, being brash, being bold, and looking tough. And until that changes, I don't think the behavior is going to change either.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. I see a question here that kind of follows up on, I think, the themes we're discussing from He Chen, who is a PhD student here in the communication department. He's also one of our China 2CI fellows. He's asking about kind of the varieties of tactics that Chinese diplomats deploy. And he said that he noticed that China doesn't employ such aggressive or assertive rhetoric towards every country or on every policy issue. For instance, it's more assertive towards Western countries than African countries or Southeast Asian countries. It's also more assertive on hard issues, on so-called national interest, and softer, like cultural issues, exchanges. How could this be explained, and do you agree with this assessment?
I do broadly agree with that assessment. I think, wolf warrior diplomacy has been at its sternest with Western countries. The distinction kind of doesn't work perfectly. I think there's been plenty of wolf warrior diplomacy toward India, for example. There's obviously been a very assertive military posture on the border between the two countries. But if you think of the Twitter account of China's consul general in Kolkata, is really pretty shocking. I think he tweeted at someone that they would be eliminated just like the virus at one point during the early stages of the coronavirus outbreak. So that's been pretty palpable, and of course that's a billion person population. We've also seen displays of wolf warrior diplomacy in places like Papua New Guinea, in Fiji, in Venezuela, and Brazil. And so the kind of developing world split isn't perfect, but I think there's something to it. And if you look at cases in Africa, for example, one, there are very few examples of it, and two, those cases that we sort of have seen of wolf warrior diplomacy have tended to be more based around anti-US rhetoric than kind of personal attacks on local political elites. And I think that reflects kind of a different set of priorities. China is still aiming to win over influence in those places. It doesn't feel embattled by criticism coming from leaders in those countries. It wants to win over opinions in the UN General Assembly, for example, and make sure it can push back against US and European criticisms of things like its human rights record. So I do think that distinction is valid, even if it's imperfect. The other distinction that I think is important, and it might not even ring true for US audiences, but I think it's accurate, is that the degree of power that a country has in the international system is really important to determining the way that China behaves. I would say that although there have been some really high-profile incidents of wolf warrior diplomacy against the US, on the whole, Chinese diplomats tend to be more measured in their tone toward Washington than they do countries like, say, Canada, France, the United Kingdom, Australia, where some of the most kind of shocking examples have played out. China's relationship with the US is just too important. The US military is too big, its economy is too powerful to be able to really embrace wolf warrior diplomacy without caveats. The case where they came closest to doing that was, I think, with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who leveled some pretty direct criticisms against the legitimacy of Communist Party rule in China, and the foreign ministry responded with this just like incredible angry vitriol. But apart from that, they've been a little bit more measured in their tone. For example, they would never personally criticize Donald Trump, even when he said very, very provocative things about China. So those two things, like developed versus developing, and then power, I think of as being quite important ways of breaking it down.
Thank you so much. It really echoes actually a paper that we're working on together with Kayu, looking at US and Chinese digital diplomacy in Africa. We're finding that China tends to echo anti-US critiques and great power rhetoric, competition, great power, notions much more frequently than the US. So even though in Washington we hear so much about China and Africa, in digital diplomacy, actually China tends to underscore the US more, kind of critiques of the US and push back. So that was something that we also observed, but at the same time, much more soft content and not as much, I guess, wolf warrior techniques applied there for the reasons you highlighted. So very interesting distinctions, but also the idea of kind of the great power, the US, but then the sort of the powers under it, European powers or Canada tends to kind of get the the most, aggressive rhetoric when it comes to showcasing China's powers.
Right.
Gap in between. I see a couple of more questions coming in here. I wanted to go back here to John Critch. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name, but John is based at Georgia Tech, a School of History and Sociology. And he's asking, isn't wolf warrior diplomacy destroying Chinese soft power, or does it in fact enhance its prestige in some countries? So does it have any positive impact potentially?
I think that the answer is that it's destroying Chinese soft power with a big caveat. I think it's the way that these displays are really off-putting to most audiences in most countries, I think. And you can see in the Pew polling, for example, across OECD countries, that there has been this precipitous decline in China's reputation. That's not just driven by Chinese diplomats, it's also driven by China's external policies and its domestic policies, which people find off-putting. But I think that the way that Chinese diplomats have played into that is that they've kind of put a human face on Chinese assertiveness. For a long time, China's foreign policies in places like the South China Sea and the East China Sea were quite provocative, but Chinese diplomats were tried to be relatively reassuring about what China was up to and its intentions, and that a lot of that has just kind of gone out of the window. And now, if you want to think of what does Chinese assertiveness look like, you're probably going to think of Zhao Lijin at the foreign ministry podium, or someone tweeting in all caps on Twitter. So I think that's played into it, and it is quite corrosive of China's international image. But there are audiences around the world that are receptive to it, and I think probably the collection of people that stands out to me the most is kind of anti-US populists. I think, people, for example, in Viktor Orban's Hungary stands out, Vladimir Putin's Russia, in quite a complicated and messy way. At points, Duterte's Philippines has also kind of found that kind of rhetoric quite appealing, although of course the China-Philippines relationship is pretty nuanced. So I think those groups have for their own reasons found China's kind of wolf warrior diplomacy quite appealing and quite useful to their agendas, and there are probably others as well, but that's the one that kind of stands out to me.
Great. So there's a question here from Dexter Lansing. He's a PhD candidate in political science department. I think he's working directly with Andy, so one of our students here, and he's asking about decentralized management, or kind of the degree of decentralization in managing diplomacy. In particular, he says in the book, there's a talk that for China's diplomats, they're oftentimes left in the dark about what the military is doing or other parts of the government are saying or doing. This idea of stovepiping. And when China's diplomats meet with their foreign counterparts, they are surprised and have to say, quote, "We don't know anything about that." At the end of 2013, beginning of 2014, the National Central Security Commission was established in part to alleviate the problem of coordination between foreign and security policy and interagency communication. Has there been any evidence that in the Xi era, there has been better policy coordination among different ministries, or is the degree of stovepiping still the same? So I think it's a really good question, building on your book.
Terrific question. It's really hard to know. So as I was I love this really impressive literature that built up on China's foreign affairs in sort of late 2000s, early 2010s, by people like Linda Jacobson, Bonnie Glaser, who wrote in great detail about these coordination problems and all of the kind of nuts and bolts of how the Chinese political system, and the foreign policy apparatus works. So as I was researching the book, I reached out to those people and many more and said, how has this changed? And the answer from most people, these are like the smartest people on this topic, tends to be we're not so sure because we can't go to Beijing and interview people. And even when we do, they won't tell us. So the degree of our ability to, I think we just have to be very honest about it. Our ability to look into this system and have an assessment of how all the pieces work is really limited. My kind of impression is that some of the coordination problems have been alleviated, not really because China's interagency process has become much better or because information sharing is improved. I still think that that the political system really struggles with that, especially at that level below vice minister. Above that, it's a bit easier for officials to talk to each other, but below that, they can't pick up the phone in the same way that officials in the US government would be able to. But I think the way that it's improved is the centralized writ of Xi Jinping's policies. This idea that Xi Jinping is in charge of the party is in charge of the government, and they're all going to sing from the same hymn sheet. And I think that has kind of helped to make the foreign policy process a little bit more unified and a little bit less chaotic than it was in the Hu Jintao days. But probably it's not the result of some great new interagency process.
Yeah, very interesting comments on interagency kind of disconnects and I guess lack of coordination. I observed this also in my soft power work in other institutions, even Confucius institutes that I've studied closely, even within one country. Some of these various classrooms don't talk to one another or are afraid to give information that may somehow appear as negative or implicate another institute. So I think this coordination issue is really vast, and it goes all the way to the very local level of individual institutes. And I found that's really striking, just how little they knew about each other, not to mention other big institutions not quite working as closely as we maybe would imagine them to be. So that's a really important part of I think the book argument and the question that Dexter was posing. You mentioned the point on sources and, your not interviews, but your communication with the scholars and how they don't know quite what's happening because they can't go back to China. So I wanted to ask you a little bit, about the research for this book, because it's just such a fascinating, rich account, and so many accounts I gather were taken from various books you collected in China, right, in Beijing, various biographies. You can just tell there's so much personal information and voices coming through directly through the book. It also looks like you've done some interviews. I see a lot of quotes there. I didn't go back to all the footnotes to see if it's direct quotes or something you've taken somewhere else, but I can see there were many conversations that were also quoted here. So just to give us a little bit of preview of what was the research like? It's a very difficult and many ways sensitive topic to study. What kind of reception did you get for this book or this work back in China? How is that going? And also, have you been able to kind of go back? I guess none of us have been going back to we're based in the States, but how has your work, I guess, been affected by this several years of not being able to return to China? So a lot of things packed in there, but primarily the research for the book. I would be curious to hear more about that.
Yeah. Okay. So start with research, and you may have to jog my memory on the follow-up questions. I tried to use the fact that I was in Beijing and reporting on Chinese foreign policy as much as I could. And so, I couldn't really go and do structured interviews with Chinese officials just because that's not, they're not really receptive to doing that with foreign journalists. But I would just be as inquisitive as I could. And of course, a lot of what I was interested in for the book wasn't really super sensitive stuff. It was you're waiting to go into an event somewhere, and as a journalist there's a lot of waiting, whether it's in the US or in China, and so you kind of talk with officials a little bit and say, what was your training process like? Did you enjoy being posted to this country or that country? What was the mood like at this time? So it's kind of softer questions, but if you ask hundreds and hundreds of times to as many people as you can, you do start to build up that kind of a feel of how it works, even though no one is telling you anything that's remotely classified or whatever. Still, so that was one kind of source. Another one was just doing much more structured interviews with foreign diplomats who had spent decades working with Chinese officials and had a sense of how the system worked, and that helped to build out some anecdotes. But as you said, that the main source, especially for the historical stuff, was these memoirs, many of which were published in the sort of 1990s, 2000s period. It's really quite remarkable how the memoirs published after 2012 just become, dramatically less useful as Xi Jinping has kind of cracked down on the environment for speech and publishing. But these books, as even though they've been censored and people are very cautious, they'll tell you their life stories, and you can go and they're published by like Anhui People's Press and Chengdu People's Press and that kind of stuff. And they never would have been mass market books, but they have little details that kind of reveal what did it feel like to be a Chinese diplomat on the front line. And if you're quite disciplined about like taking the chronology of Chinese foreign affairs and what was going on, and then comparing it with their personal responses, you can build up something that's quite interesting. So in the late 50s, no one is going to write a passage that says, and then Mao Zedong launched a disastrous set of policies that led to the Great Leap Forward and mass famine. But they'll say, I was so hungry that it hurt to lie down on my side, or I went home and I found people eating tree bark and grass and stuff like that. In the summer of 1989, no one will write about like the political events that had just taken place in Beijing, but they will say no one in Brussels was willing to have lunch with me. And so you just take a bunch of examples like that, add them together, and it starts to paint up kind of a rich picture. So that's how I did it, just like one little shard of glass at a time, and then you try to recreate the stained glass window from that.
I think it's really an impressive skill, and something to also note for students, writers, anybody who's listening. It's just the idea that some of these sources, of course, as you mentioned, 2012 and after is not quite the same picture, but those older books, some of them may appear as, oh, maybe it's just propaganda or this person was censored, but yet you do piece out this incredible insights. And that's what I loved so much about the book, was finding those, those vignettes, those very colorful descriptions that really take you to that space, to that place. And kind of you can picture sitting by the side of this diplomat and kind of experiencing these events with him through very intricate, small details that I think is really, really powerful. And just to follow up on that in terms of the post 2012. So did this book get a reception in China? And did your diplomat friends or former colleagues or interlocutors, did they react to the book? Have they read it? Like what's been kind of the mood there?
I would say that there hasn't been any big reception to it. I had someone sort of say in a more official capacity, we have noted that you have written a book about the Chinese foreign ministry, but no comment either way. And someone told me, I heard secondhand that someone who'd spoken to some Chinese diplomats that they felt like I did a good job of characterizing the dilemma that Chinese diplomats face, and this trade-off between, this constant tightrope that they have to walk between domestic audiences and foreign audiences. That they thought that was accurate, but they thought that I was too pessimistic about the way that Chinese foreign policy is unfolding now, and that the chances of a kind of recalibration were greater than I kind of characterized. So that was kind of nice to have that feedback. And I remember, a different, I remember the scholar James C. Scott at Yale, an anthropologist, reading something that he'd written when he said that your work should, the people that you're writing about, they don't necessarily need to agree with the way that you characterize things, but they should at least be able to recognize themselves in the thing that you've written. And so I kind of felt like that piece of feedback fitted in that category, and I was kind of pleased with that.
That makes sense. It sounds, to me, that sounds like a compliment. We're asserting the key themes basically that you that you cover without fully admitting to everything, because that may be
right. Right.
That makes sense. I wanted to turn to Trevor Williams here next. He's the editor of Global Atlanta, a news service focused on international business here locally. He often writes on Chinese investment in Georgia and across the South. So he asked more broadly, I guess, not so much about perhaps diplomacy per se, but more so information war. He's asking whether China is winning the information war in your view. Does the US have an answer for the fact that China can use the tools of open society, namely social media, to spread its messages in the US and around the world, even while the US has no analog to speak to the Chinese public? How can the US, Europe, and other countries, continents counter this without undercutting the commitment to openness and free speech? So this kind of unequal information environments, and what do you think about that?
So it's a terrific question. And there is a debate. I was speaking to a US official about this question just this week. And there's a debate going on in the government at the moment, which I think is a little bit analogous to the way that people thought about China and open and free markets a while ago. The argument for a long time when it came to the economy was that protectionist practices in China will end up hurting their economy. We benefit from openness, so we should just go with that and embrace it, and it will work out for us in the long run. We don't need to think about industrial policy or market interventions in order to compete. And that debate has shifted quite substantially to a point where now even Republicans are talking about some forms of industrial policy, and there's a belief that I can't endorse this perspective as a journalist, but like there's a belief that the openness is something that China can exploit, and that there need to be proactive steps taken to address that. I would say that and that debate is kind of is quite advanced. There's a much more nascent debate about the information environment, where again the argument for a long time was the US benefits from openness. We don't need to do disinformation. We tell the truth. And that speaks for itself and has a great power, and we should be confident about our system. And I think there are some people now who are starting to think that in a similar way, there are these asymmetries, right? The US finds it hard to speak to the Chinese public. The Chinese Communist Party has the ability to put China daily inserts into, newspapers. There are Chinese official accounts on Twitter, which is blocked in China, and all of that kind of stuff. And so that debate is starting to shift a little bit. I mean, I think on the whole, that China is still very much on the back foot when it comes to the global information environment. You speak to Chinese officials about it, they feel, as I was saying earlier, this incredible frustration at their inability to get their message out. And one of the reasons they've embraced things like Twitter is because they feel like they don't get a fair hearing by Western media, and that Chinese outlets don't have the same clout globally, which is true, even if they're massively funded. So I don't know that I would characterize it as China winning the information war, but I would say that China is making enough inroads to make US officials really start to think about whether they need to change their approach to this competition.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
It was kind of a long answer, but I hope that answers the question.
Lots of new dynamics brought out through the answers. Thank you. Andy, I'm going to turn to you next. I know you have another question eager to ask, so we're excited to hear you.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by your argument about the absolute tight, ironclad discipline of Chinese diplomats. As Maria alluded, I'm working on a new book, which is basically on, she asked me to give the title, which has changed many times, but it's currently called Triple Paradox: The Failure of the CCP's War on Corruption and Xi Jinping's battle with corruption. When I look at China, I look at a state that is absolutely resistant to the top, that it's striking that even after a decade now of the anti-corruption drive, you find people who are not only continuing to engage in corruption, but actually have turned corrupt in the midst of this putatively fierce crackdown on corruption. Is it simply that the diplomatic corps is much smaller, much more vulnerable? but why would one corner of the Chinese officialdom behave like China's civilian army, and yet at the same time, the army itself was rotten to the core? Of course, you had two very senior generals, Guo Boxian and Su Sai-he, removed and imprisoned. Well, Su ducked it by dying on him. But why the diplomatic corps is so different, or is it different?
I think it's a great question. I'd say a few things. First, I guess Chinese top leaders haven't always felt like the diplomatic corps is perfectly on side. Mao Zedong, in the lead up to the Cultural Revolution, described it as an independent kingdom or an independent fiefdom, which he wanted to kind of bring down to size. And he felt like it wasn't sufficiently responsive, and unleashed a whole world of chaos on the foreign ministry in subsequent years. But I think on the whole, the picture of but even in that case, there was great discipline. It was just that the discipline and loyalty Mao felt it was too much directed at Zhou Enlai and not enough at him. I think the answer sort of lies in a few things. First, it's a relatively small bureaucracy. Second, it is headquartered in Beijing, both sort of literally and figuratively very, very close to the top leadership. And third, I think that the issue set has traditionally been an area which has been really preserved for China's paramount leader or a very small group of people around that person. This is not, it's not like economic policy where there's a great deal of decentralization and local power. This is a small group of people whose priorities are set by another very small group of people sitting in Zhongnanhai, especially when it comes to issues like US-China relations, which is really very, very tightly held. I think there is a bit more decentralization, and there are more sort of principal agent problems when it comes to countries where China's foreign direct investment, for example, plays a very big role in China's external policies. The foreign ministry itself has found it very, very difficult to exert control over what's happening with state-owned enterprises on the ground, or the degree of influence the Ministry of Commerce has, or the provincial governments, the role that they play in China's foreign affairs in some countries. So there are still those kind of coordination problems in Chinese foreign policy, but the foreign ministry, while it doesn't represent the totality of the foreign affairs apparatus, the foreign ministry itself has tended to be pretty disciplined for those reasons.
Interesting. So we have only about 6 minutes left. I see a new question from Trevor here. Does the book address the implications for the broader relationship of the Chinese consulate in Houston's closure on allegations of espionage? Was this a preemptive strike by the US on wolf warrior diplomacy on US soil? How does the Chinese side see this? So I guess very specific question related to the Chinese consulate in Houston. I don't know if you have any insight on that as a journalist, or something that I know I don't remember you covering that specifically in the book, but maybe I've missed that. So that's
I don't think it was in the book. And in truth, I've not written extensively about this issue. It's just been something that I've written about in kind of the broader context of US-China relations. The accusation at the time was that the Houston consulate had been a hotbed of espionage, and specifically had been involved, I believe, in the theft of industrial secrets. I honestly don't know. I honestly haven't looked into those accusations. What I can say in a kind of general sense is that Chinese intelligence uses the diplomatic apparatus. They kind of, in the cultural sections of embassies in particular, tend to be like a favored place for putting Ministry of State Security officials, but that China's intelligence apparatus doesn't primarily rely on the use of people placed in embassies. The Soviets used embassies a great deal. The CIA in the US case uses its embassy network. But in the Chinese case, there's a bit more of a sort of decentralized system where the Ministry of State Security tends to be run out of these city and provincial level bureaus, which then have their own international networks. They use a combination of kind of professional intelligence collectors together with this kind of wide web of collectors based in academic institutions, students, people working for state-owned enterprises, the Chinese state media, to cast a very wide net. And so embassies and consulates, I think, are involved. But my impression, and again, this is like the most opaque part of like a very, very opaque political system, but my impression is actually that the diplomatic network is not central to the way that intelligence is collected in China. So that's kind of like offering general comments to a specific case, but I hope it's somewhat helpful.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes left, and I just wanted to ask kind of a broader concluding question in terms of future, writings or research on this topic of Chinese diplomacy, in particular, wolf warrior diplomacy, or just in general, the kind of top themes that maybe didn't make it directly into your book, or issues that you were very intrigued by, but you were hoping to write about more. What are some of those issues do you think that you would recommend others to dig into, or you yourself are looking to maybe write more about? I don't know if you're still interested in writing more on this topic after publishing a whole book, but what are maybe some of the kind of ideas that perhaps you kind of felt like, oh, that could be a little bit more done on this, or I wish I could get more sources on this particular issue?
Yeah, so I think I can write another book on Chinese foreign affairs based on memoirs. It was like too tiring, and maybe, but
very labor intensive. Yeah,
I definitely need some time to recover. But what was very clear to me was that first, I wasn't able to get through all of the memoirs by Chinese diplomats. There are still a bunch of books out there that I didn't get to. Second, there is a huge number of books that write about the history of the foreign affairs system writ large outside of the foreign ministry. So there are, and I read some of them, but like the International Liaison Department, the United Front Work Department, all of the friendship associations, then institutions that, I read one book which was about Chinese trade union diplomacy. It's not a fun book, but it did, it was interesting. It did have stuff in it. All of those kind of like governmental institutions which are somehow involved in diplomacy, think sports diplomacy, then think of all of the institutions which didn't used to play any kind of diplomatic role, but now do. So for example, the People's Bank of China, the environmental regulators, other financial regulators, all of these departments now are part of China's foreign affairs apparatus in some way. And then of course, there is this absolutely staggeringly large literature on the People's Liberation Army in Chinese, much of which has actually been, I think, much better integrated into Western literature, just because the DC think tank community, when it comes to Chinese military affairs, is quite well funded, and they have used quite a lot of these texts. But anyway, there is a massive amount of opportunity to take that world of kind of public source information and integrate that into the literature on Chinese foreign affairs. I just don't know if I have the stamina to be the person who does it.
Well, thank you so much. It's a very enriching to hear these insights, and maybe some of our students will pick up and dig into some of these books. So I hope this inspired some of us, to go into these directions, which, again, are available through public sources, but need, of course, an insane amount of labor that I think we have to applaud Peter for doing so much of this for this book.
The way, I'm sorry, just very quickly, the way for people to do that is the way I did it anyway, is just keyword searches on Baidu. So just hundreds of like different combinations, things. So I did stuff like Chinese diplomat memoir, Chinese diplomat looks back, Chinese diplomat recollects, just as many combinations as I could, and then so Chinese diplomat recollects book, and like in Chinese, and like just as many combinations as you can, and you'll find an amazing number of books on websites like Confucius.net, which is a secondhand book website. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, you were wrapping up, but I just
No,
thought I
it's
would
very
add.
generous, and I hope we, some of us listening here will pick up on these tips. Very insightful. So thank you so much, Peter. It was really wonderful for you to come here and share your insights. I know we're not in person, but it's nonetheless, I think it's been a great conversation. And I'll leave to Diana to maybe thank other participants and wrap up.
Okay, thank you. And on behalf of the Atlanta Global Studies Center, I do want to thank Maria and Andy, and especially Peter Martin, for this rich discussion. It was really great. And I found it very fascinating, to hear about your research process. And for all of you in the audience, if you haven't had a chance to pick up this book, I hope you'll add it to your reading list.
Here it is, very colorful.
There it is. And thank you to everyone again. And
only $10, I think, so very affordable.
Even less on Kindle.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, for all of you on a college budget, it's very affordable. So yes, and the video will be available on our YouTube channel in a few days. So we hope you'll check out some of our other sessions and other speakers there. So everyone have a good weekend, and thank you again.
Thank you
so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks.